Welcome to Why You Should Consider Land Trust. We have some amazing panelists here to tell us a little bit about land trust and answer your questions at the end. So please leave your questions in the Q&A box. My name is Janae Gaines. I'm an Associate Development Project Manager at Alta Housing. Previously, we were known as Palo Alto Housing. I have been in affordable housing for about a year and a half now, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kat, to introduce herself and CoHo.
Thanks so much for the intro, Janae. So we're very excited to bring you why you should consider land trust today. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who CoHo is. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. So first of all, CoHo is, well, actually, first of all, my name is Kat Wortham. I'm the Health and Housing Policy Senior Associate for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. So to tell you a little bit about CoHo, or the Coalition of Housers. CoHo for short is a network of new and emerging leaders working in and advocating for affordable housing in the South Bay. CoHo was developed from the need to support early and mid-career housers through workshops, trainings, networking, and social events. CoHo does have a number of upcoming events, which we'll mention at the end of today's program. So make sure you stick around. I will drop the link for those events in the chat box in just a couple of minutes. If you're interested in signing up to the CoHo listserv and becoming a part of CoHo, please send your email and a private message to myself or Janae. We'll now turn it over to our panelists, starting with Ofelia, to give us their name, title, and a little bit about their organization. We'll start with Ofelia.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Kat. My name is Ofelia Bello. I am currently the executive director of a local grassroots nonprofit here in East Palo Alto, kind of the southern mid-peninsula area of the Bay Area. And the nonprofit I work for is Youth United for Community Action. We have a long history of doing tenants advocacy, tenants rights, equitable land use. And I'm also the board chair of our local community land trust, PAHALI. So I've been with PAHALI for a couple of years. I think I've been with PAHALI a little longer than I've been with YUCA, Youth United for Community Action, but both of those organizations have a lot of synergies because for us, as I'll talk about a little bit in my presentation, the tenants' rights advocacy is super connected to the community land trust long-term affordability efforts that we have here in our community. So yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Thanks, Ofelia. Next, we'll turn it over to Francis.
Thank you. Something I should also note is Ofelia was also one of the board members of the California Community Land Trust Network, which was really great that she was on that board. I'm Francis McIlveen. I'm with the Northern California Land Trust. I've been working for NCLT for 17 years, so I've served in a lot of different roles. At this point, I call myself Director of Operations and Development. So besides like operations of the organization, really kind of co-directing and to some extent with our executive director, I focus a lot on the development of new projects and programs. NCLT was established in 1973. We've gone through a lot of sort of cyclical ups and downs. We really are subject to the real estate market in a certain way, and in our, you know, how well we can function. We were initially founded as we are a community land trust, and our emphasis is on both community land trust projects, housing projects, but also in being kind of a technical assistance resource and helping other organizations and other community land trusts get up and running, and just to really disseminate the model. To that effect, we were one of the founding members of both the National Community Land Trust about 15 years ago and in the California Community Land Trust Network. So we've had our hands in a lot of, you know, policy and model, pushing the model. And yeah, back to you all.
Thanks, Francis. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Michael.
Hi, all. I'm Michael Trujillo. I'm a staff attorney at the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley. I work in our housing program, so I do support our direct services eviction defense work. I also do some affirmative litigation around fair housing and civil rights related to housing related matters, and some policy advocacy as well. But I'm, in my free time, a self-described CLT nerd, and just am all about learning the history and the prospects for this exciting movement, and I've had the pleasure of supporting South Bay CLT here in San Jose as they get off the ground.
Thanks, Michael. And we do have one extra special guest that I'd like to turn it over to her to introduce herself today. We have Yaslin Hernandez, and I'll leave it to her to introduce herself.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, everyone. My name is Yoselin Hernandez, and I am a member of the South Bay CLT. I started in this work a couple of years ago and have had the pleasure to work alongside of all of these folks here. Our work in San Jose is very much dedicated and committed to decommodified housing and community-led housing projects and models. We truly see the connection to health and housing, and see the urgent need for it in San Jose and throughout the Bay Area. In my role in the South Bay CLT, I lead a lot of the educational programmings along with all of other community folks who are volunteers. And so we're glad to be here and spread the word about our efforts. So thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jocelyn. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Ofelia, who will be our first panelist today.
Thank you, Kat. And should I go ahead and share my own screen? Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Whatever your preference is.
Okay. I sent it over to you, so if you would not mind, I sent you a PDF version, and that would be just as simple.
I'll share it now. Give me just a second.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay. So I'm super excited to present to you all, and also a little bit intimidated because there are many housing experts here today, and my portion of it, of course, is Community Land Trust 101. So if some of this information is terribly basic, I apologize and bear with me. And if it's new or there are elements of it that are new, I hope it's inspiring and somewhat kind of introduces new concepts. So, or maybe reframes things in a way that we haven't talked about yet in the mainstream, at a mainstream level. So with that, the one thing that I want to mention as well is that this presentation, I adapted it from a previous one that we did in community. So you'll see black text is in English, the orange text is in Spanish. I left it on there because why not? I'll be presenting today just in English, but the orange text again is in Spanish. So don't feel like there's information that is not being communicated. It's there, it's just in a different language. So thank you, Kat. With that, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so I thought I'd start with a quick problem statement, or just a brief problem side of why we're even talking about community land trust today. I think currently the mainstream and dominant way of making housing available to people is by producing new housing at market rate, right? Just straight up building new housing. Many developers are private, profit-seeking developers, and there's affordable housing developers. But generally speaking, housing gets constructed and either rented or sold at its market value or at an affordable value if you're an affordable housing developer. But this approach is very limited in its ability to house all people who need housing. There's a consensus here in East Palo Alto, and I think in many communities, that we need an array of approaches. There's no silver bullet at this point to address the housing insecurity, instability issue, scarcity. But we do know that we need various approaches to make headway, which takes me to CLTs. In our work, we look at CLTs as a preservation strategy, but not just preserving homes and making them available. It's also about preserving the very fabric of our community. Next slide, please. The other part of the problem that we need to address that's inextricable from the housing issue is the racial inequality, and we need to do that by design. As this graphic shows, the majority of government subsidies benefit the rich, while most people who need housing assistance don't get the assistance they need. More specifically, low-income people of color, especially Black families, were historically and currently still excluded from homeownership opportunities and redlined into less resourced neighborhoods. I'm sure many of you might have seen the recent articles that went viral about a Black family being appraised at a much lower rate. And then once they removed all kind of indications of being a Black family, their appraisal went up by thousands and thousands of dollars. Today in East Palo Alto, with tech companies like Facebook and Amazon moving in, there's now there's a tension on our historically disinvested community. We've become more desirable, which has spurred a cycle of speculation and displacement for us. Preservation policies and collective ownership opportunities like CLTs can help us address the problems that the speculative market creates. That said, I won't go into it too deep in my presentation. I know one of my peer presenters will today, but I'd be remiss to not mention that the root of the modern CLT movement here in the United States is deeply intertwined with the civil rights movement, and more specifically in the form of an agricultural co-op out of Georgia. So I think that we'll go into that a little later. Next slide, please. So in East Palo Alto, when we think about the housing policies we want to advocate for, we have to think about these policies to help address these 5 housing pillars of housing justice. Typically, when we're in dialogue with community or doing a presentation like this to our predominantly renter community, we ask them which of these pillars already exist for them, or already exist in their housing, and which ones lack. Here, where many folks are renters, we often hear long-term stability lacks. We hear affordability lacks. Many units are not up to par when it comes to habitability. And then we also hear that even for folks who live in affordable units, community control lacks, right? So needless to say, most housing types don't consist of all of these pillars, but who would we be if we didn't try to achieve these? So enter stage community land trusts. Next slide, please. So as all of you housing experts know, community land trusts are just one of many forms of housing options that can help address the speculative market that is spurring displacement and a host of issues for our families here in the Bay Area. Here you see the a bullet point list of quote unquote traditional approaches to housing. And as one of the sub-bullet points for collective ownership, you see CLT. I apologize for the acronyms. We were told to spell everything out. LEHC is Limited Equity Housing Co-op. CLT is Community Land Trust. So yes, that's where community land trusts fall in kind of, at least in this quick bullet point range of housing models. Next slide, please. So now getting into the real 101 of community land trust. What is a community land trust? This is kind of a general definition. It's more nuanced than this. It can get a lot more nuanced than this, but this is kind of the bare bones, one form of them at least. A nonprofit, all of my tabs just crashed, okay. A CLT is a nonprofit organization that acquires land and stewards it in perpetual trust for the benefit of low-income communities. In our case, in East Palo Alto, when we're talking about our low-income communities, communities of color, working class communities, we're talking about a community that's largely immigrant. We have a very large population of immigrant community members. And when it comes to our demographics, we're predominantly Latino, also Black, African-American, and Pacific Islander. So that's who we're talking about in East Palo Alto. That's who we want to help preserve and stay here in our community. Next slide, please. This is a quick snapshot. I wanted to shout out some, I think not all of them. South Bay Community Land Trust is on here. I'm not sure. We might need to update it. some of the many community land trusts that are here in the Bay Area. So even though community land trusts may not have caught on full steam, at least from my vantage point, have not fully caught on steam in the same way that other housing models have, it's still a movement. It's certainly a movement on the East Coast of, I had another slide that had kind of a map of community land trusts throughout the country, but I wanted to shout out the specific ones in the Bay Area. So here's a quick snapshot, some of which are represented here today through the panelists and I think also from attendees. So shout out to you all and your communities. Next slide, please. Nearing the end here, the 3 core values of a community land trust are made up by these 3 bullet points called out on this slide: community control, permanent affordability, and stewardship, actually controlling and having decision-making power about your housing. Next slide, please. So who makes that decision? Who has that decision-making power? Typically, there's this, it slices up into 3 pieces. CLT residents have decision-making power when it comes to their housing units. Neighbors of neighboring residents of the CLT, other folks in the neighborhood, and technical experts, folks like yourselves, and other people who are mission aligned and represent organizations in that work. Next slide, please. If nothing else, for the folks who this is a real intro to CLTs, if nothing else sticks, I think this is one of the most important graphics for me when I'm giving this presentation to community members. Essentially, community land trusts offer permanent affordability by separating the value of the house from the value of the land. The price of the home is tied to the income of the person who will be living there, which makes it affordable in perpetuity. And then the land is a community asset. It's held by the community land trust. And it hosts the home, if you will, that is set aside for community members in the workforce or just folks in the community. Next slide, please. This next slide basically shows that although in the previous graphic you saw what is essentially a single family home, an array of different types of housing can sit on top of the land, right? So this graphic, all it shows is different types of housing that can go on there: single family, limited equity housing co-op, condos, multifamily rental. So I really like this graphic as well. And next slide, please. Finally, stewardship or slash, administración, I was going to interpret. The last pillar, or the last kind of core value of community land trust, is that it stays affordable in perpetuity, and that families are able to, the residents of the homes and the people on the board of the community land trust are able to continue stewarding the land and their own homes. So this graphic simply just shows how the price of a community land trusted home stays much more constant over time, as opposed to homes that are offered at market value, which continue going up. And with that, I think my next slide simply has questions. Yes, that is the end of it. I try to go through it pretty quickly to yield the time to my colleagues. And I imagine that there might be time at the end for some questions, Kat, if that's right. Okay, so with that, I will pass it on.
Perfect. Thanks so much. A round of applause, Ofelia. That was such a great introduction into what a community land trust is. And now we're going to dive a little bit deeper. I'm going to switch out my slides and turn it over to Francis.
Thank you. So to dive a little bit deeper, building off of what Ofelia so wonderfully laid out, one of the key pieces I want to highlight is Ofelia showed you that graphic of the 3 stakeholder groups that are making decisions about the stewardship of these projects and the goal of the CLT. That's actually embedded in the model of the community land trust movement. So there are all kinds of community land trusts as organizational types, but one of the core values is a tripartite board structure, where you write into the bylaw, a third of the board members have to be from the resident group, like people that live in the housing. a third of them have to be from the community. And it's different interpretations of that, of what represents the community. Sometimes it's geographic, sometimes it's particular community groups, or maybe it's public entities. And the third are people that have some kind of special technical expertise to move the agenda forward. Let me just back up, since we have these slides up, and I'm going to revisit the question of why community land trusts. Why this model? What's the benefit of it, at least in hard numbers? So one of the things I like to point out is through the community land trust model, because of the permanent affordability. So in other words, not affordability restrictions that expire after 10, 30, or even 55 years. They're permanent through the legal structure. The subsidy that gets put into the projects appreciates over time, and it can have a really dramatic appreciation depending on the real estate market that you're operating in. So this here is just a snapshot of, at the time, I think I did this about 3 years ago. This is just a snapshot of NCLT's ownership units. At that time, we had 40 units in Berkeley and in Oakland predominantly. I looked at all of those units. The original amount of subsidy, the average amount that was in nominal dollars, was about $28,000 per unit. The next point is the current, at that time, restricted value of those homes was about $111,000 per unit. That's like studio to 3-bedroom. The average market value was $442,000, based on comparables and appraisals, actually, of those specific properties. That means that with a $28,000 subsidy that had been put in either by public or private sources, at this point in time, 20 years later, the value of that subsidy was now $330,000. So that's the amount that you would have to plug back in. If you move to the next, could you do the next slide, please? Thank you. This kind of shows that in graphic form. So the blue column shows what's an affordable mortgage for an 80% AMI family. I'm not sure the family size I used is probably like 2 or 3 person household. And you could see that it steadily increases. This is based on the AMI. And the back, the orange columns show the fluctuations of that housing market. You know, it did dip in 2010, but the median home price, just was in Alameda County, was $780,000 in 2016. If you go to the next slide, please. That shows, this reiterates the gap. So here you have, in 2017, that blue segment is how much could that typical 80% household afford. They could afford that much. But if they wanted to buy one of the units that are in our portfolio, they would have this huge gap, this $330,000 gap, that normally that would come from some, you know, maybe a down payment assistance program or some other municipal entity housing subsidy. And that's where that gap keeps growing year after year after year. It's essentially, that original subsidy is now worth 1,000% more than when, you know, because of the housing market. Boy, I really took a lot of time on that, sorry. I want to just kind of quickly move on to the different structures of CLTs, how projects can be done within CLT model. It's a very flexible model. It's essentially a legal model to ensure that affordability and to ensure community control and involvement. But what you do on top of the land can vary incredibly. You can have single family homes, which it's simply a split title. The affordability covenants are codified in a recorded 99-year ground lease. And that ground lease has the occupancy, the affordability, the income restrictions in it. And there's a model lease that's used for single family homes that enables us to get Fannie Mae backed mortgages for those home buyers. Another model is the limited equity housing cooperative. And similar to the single family home, the residents own the property, and the land lease between the owners and the land trust codifies the restrictions. But in that case, it's a legal co-op, it's a corporate structure. So the home owners actually own a share of the co-op, and that ownership of that share confers the right to occupy a unit. The co-op itself legally owns title to the building. Another version, another flavor of that is what we call community or zero equity co-ops. Similar operating structure, but the title is still held by the land trust, and that has to do with, right now, the tax disadvantage to limited equity housing co-ops. They have to pay market rate taxes that can make the project unaffordable, and this is just a workaround in order to get a property tax exemption when you have your housing folks at below 80% AMI. Another model are condominiums. They're airspace condominiums where we sell the individual units to the homeowners. There's a land lease like the single family home structure where we lease an undivided fractional share of the land to that homeowner, has the same affordability covenants and restrictions. And also they use their own, credit and down payment resources and mortgage to acquire the home, but it's the cost of the land is taken out. So it's that affordability is what's built in. Another model that we do use is rentals, where the land trust will own the rental property outright. And those are funded through a variety of mechanisms. One thing to note with the community land trust model, we don't typically have access to low-income housing tax credits. We're typically doing smaller projects, or we're using the ultimate model. If it's like an ownership model with co-ops, it's just not suited to the LIHTC funding requirements. That said, there are CLTs in the country, including some in California, that do have LIHTC rental projects that are sitting on CLT land. And so I think the point I'm trying to make is that the model is really adaptable to many different types and uses of housing. And Michael will actually go into that, and he talks about the history of CLTs. The last thing I want to mention is that the funding sources that we use for projects are really, I think, really similar to other affordable housing projects, with the exception of typically not having access to LIHTC. We're going after state and local funding, CDBG money, housing trust fund money. We're going after foundation grant money and donations. And then in the cases where we're partnering with co-ops, the residents themselves, they bring some funds to it as well. And with that, that's 10 minutes. So I'll pass it on to Michael.
Thanks, Francis. In just a minute, Michael, I'm going to bring up your slide. All right. Great, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Mike.
All right, great, seeing it now. All right, thanks all. I really appreciate Ofelia and Francis giving that introduction and kind of digging into the numbers there on CLTs. So I said at the introduction, I'm kind of a self-described CLT nerd, and I've just been really grateful for the opportunity to be a part of the South Bay Community Land Trust and the CLT movement. It is has a deep history and a lot of forward-looking potential. So I just want to share that with folks today, and hopefully you come away with some of the excitement that I have for this movement. So go to the next slide. Let's see. So I'm going to start out kind of framing the CLT movement according to this frame that John Emius Davis uses, who's kind of the preeminent historian on CLTs. And he describes CLTs as coming out of this tension that we have in the US between competing values and land ownership. On the one hand, we have this value of private ownership that's kind of rooted in American ideals around individualism and do-it-yourselfism, and under that kind of value, land should really be used and managed by individuals to kind of create wealth for those managing it, for the owners of that land. On the other side, however, there's this value of stewardship that's always been a very live value in the US. And stewardship is this land value that says land should really be used and managed for the long-term good of the people living on it, as well as future generations, and the ecosystem as well. So looking into, let's see if I can get the slide to advance. I might need you to do that, Kat.
Michael, did it advance on your end?
It did not. Did it on, maybe my video is frozen up.
We want to see if we can, do you want to switch screens and share on your end?
That's all right. I think it got to the right place eventually. I'm not sure if that was me or you, but I'm nervous about kind of starting over from here. So let's stick with this, and if you don't mind advancing the slide. That's great.
Sounds good.
All right. So digging more into this, idea of stewardship as a land value, I want to really explain, what the origins of that are, and also, honor those who worked to create this as a land value. And really the first thing I want to mention about the origin of this land value is it being a core value to so many of the Native American peoples that lived here on this continent before Western European settlers arrived. And there are accounts of early settlers describing forests that were so well managed and so such fine hunting grounds you could drive a wagon through between the trees. Well, guess what? That was due to stewardship, to the centuries and of land management and active stewardship of that land through the traditional ecological knowledge of Native American tribes that were here. But this value is also very alive in some of the early colonists. We see it, kind of at play in the New England commons, town commons, as well as in the writing of Thomas Paine. I'm sure if any of you have read Common Sense, that's kind of the origin of many of these values from the American standpoint. Henry George is also a very important figure in the creation of kind of stewardship as a land value. He was the first to kind of connect the idea of the social increment, which I will mention later on, to kind of the way that land is actually kind of managed and used. But I think in general, I was, in learning about CLTs, I've been surprised, I guess, at the extent to which these stewardship values were so broadly shared earlier in our country's history. So here we have a quote from Abraham Lincoln on kind of how land should be used or managed. Here he's suggesting that kind of no person should be in possession directly or complete control of the land. So, those values kind of took form in some of the early examples of common land management. So these are, if we're thinking about a community land trust as a community and a land and a trust, these kind of had the land and the trust set up. There wasn't that community value yet. But of course, but there were kind of common holdings that were starting to pool land together and structure land ownership in a way that kind of resembles a CLT today. So one example of that are the single tax communities that were set up in the early 20th century. And essentially these have all rent paid to, the town government. And that is kind of the single and only needed source of funding for all of the municipal affairs. There are similar planned communities that came out of the Tennessee Valley Authority and kind of the New Deal. But there's also a very, very rich tradition of Black cooperatives and cooperative farms. Fannie Lou Hamer had a Freedom Farm, as well as Quinona Farm was another really well-known Black cooperative farm in this era. And so here, you have this idea of kind of common ownership and management starting to take form. There are also some international models kind of taking shape at the same time. And I'll talk about two of the most kind of significant are in India, the Gramdan movement, the villages essentially following Indian independence. You had Vinoba Bhava, the kind of considered one of the spiritual leaders of India following Gandhi's assassination, going across India, convincing landowners of all income and wealth levels to actually donate their land holdings to the village so that that land could be managed in common. And that was successful. There are hundreds of these villages that were set up during this period. In Israel, there was a model called kibbutz. It's a model that is kind of a CLT plus. It's actually cooperative on sort of every level. So even in kind of their economic system, in their the way they raise children, in terms of obviously land ownership and management, it's all collectively managed and sustained and stewarded for the common good. And so the kibbutz is kind of is an important, I guess, starting point for the community land trust movement in the US. So during the civil rights movement, as folks were starting to organize for, voting rights, education rights, all of these civil rights, there was a growing recognition that kind of economic stability was a kind of an essential precursor to actually being able to kind of realize and assert those rights. And so there came to be a lot of interest within the civil rights movement in kind of creating a model that would give people that stability and that independence to, actually realize their rights. So there was a group of organizers in Georgia that actually went and visited a kibbutz and did a tour of Israel to learn more about this model. And out of that trip, the first community land trust was born. Okay, if we could advance the slide. let's see, I think it went, there we go. So let's take a stab at playing the video, and we'll stop it quickly if the sound's not working. I'm not getting any sound, so I'll just go ahead and explain. I was hoping to feature Charles and Shirley Sherrod, who were two of the organizers who founded New Communities, Inc., which is the US's first community land trust. It was started as a collective farm. They actually, and I highly recommend you all to watch the Arc of Justice film. It kind of explains this history, but they actually had that farm completely burned down because of the resistance to this idea, and had to kind of start over, and which they were able to do very successfully. But in it, Charles Sherrod talks about what this meant to have independence, to be able to steward their own land for their community, and to actually have a place where they could assert their rights. So this was kind of bringing the community into the land trust model. There were these kind of common leaseholdings around the country, but none that really integrated this collective management in a way that was so closely tied to a common purpose. So let's go ahead and advance the slide. So I want to kind of turn now to the other side of this and dig in on speculation as private ownership as a land value, and what that leads to, which is speculation. And the reason that leads to speculation is because of what John Stuart Mills calls the social increment. So basically, this is the observation that most of the value that comes from the appreciation in land is actually due to things going on around and outside of that land, right? It's the things that are developing around that property that make it a desirable place to live or to own. It's not necessarily, anything that's built or done to the land itself. So if we could advance once, and if I could interject, I think that this is really a driving force around the kind of Western expansion and the need to acquire more and more land out of, a desire for that wealth that comes from speculation and the social increment that accrues as communities develop around land that's been purchased. So here we can see in this GIF, or GIF, however you prefer, that it's a pretty shocking and violent time in our country's history, in which the vast majority of Native American lands holding, which I would point out were, again, being stewarded for the common good, were dispossessed and transferred to private ownership. And go to the next slide. Okay. And so this, land speculation and kind of private ownership of land was really exacerbated by segregation and systemic racism throughout the 20th century. And so through racially restricted covenants, the practice of redlining, we have governments actually taking an active role in allowing speculation to occur in some areas, and not in others, and creating places where land values would appreciate in a particular way, and for particular people, right? That essentially redlining is a way to ensure that this social increment accrues within wealthy white communities instead of within communities of color. And so, you know, this is a redlining map here of San Jose. And you can see that if you're familiar with San Jose, this map actually corresponds to existing neighborhoods in San Jose in a pretty striking way. And we have, you know, the blue lined areas, the more affluent green and blue areas of the map kind of are still the wealthy neighborhoods in San Jose, and those redlined or undesirable places to live in San Jose are some of our more low-income neighborhoods. So after redlining was over in the late 70s, you know, that kind of set the stage for redevelopment, which unfortunately, you know, although it opened up some of these red-lined and yellow-lined neighborhoods to development, lost our slideshow. Let's see. Okay, is there a way to get back to the slideshow? Am I out of time?
Yeah, give me, no, you're not out of time. Give me just a second. My Wi-Fi went down, which is the not perk of working from home. So give me like 30 seconds. Are we back up?
Yep, super, thank you. So if we could advance here. And so as Ofelia and Francis explained, CLTs kind of directly address this issue of community control and segregation. They bring land under community control through this three-part board of directors. So you have the residents themselves having a say in what's going on with the property. You have folks from within the neighborhood making sure that, you know, those properties stay affordable and are stewarded for the common good appropriately. And then you have those subject matter experts that kind of allow things to happen as a community desires. So let's go forward one. So, you know, kind of continuing to trace this problematic history of land speculation to the current moment, our kind of next stop is the 2008 financial crisis, which some have described as the greatest loss of wealth to people of color in modern US history. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, we may be setting a new record, and you know, that's obviously troubling to think about, but I think maybe many of the same challenges that we're trying to prepare for now come out of our experience in 2008, where we saw a lot of speculation, especially in the Bay Area, you know, large corporations coming in and buying up what were, you know, formerly single-family homes owned by people of color. But 2008 was also interesting because it gave us a chance to see, you know, with CLTs kind of now in the mix in the US, how those properties performed as opposed to those non-CLT properties. And that was really striking. So if you could advance once. So we can see that during, you know, the financial crisis, about 1/10 of the number of homes foreclosed as opposed to market rate homes. Now, that's pretty striking in itself, but even more impressive given that, CLT properties are for low-income families. So, these are folks that ordinarily would have, be under the most pressure with respect to foreclosure. So advance one more. And so, I think both presenters have really covered this well. The kind of forward-looking prospect of CLTs is really exciting. They use a one-time subsidy to create this permanent affordability and pay off, many times over in the long run. So again, by removing that land from the speculative market, by bringing it under the stewardship of a community-controlled board of directors, there are huge long-term payoffs. That's, although that initial subsidy can be large in a place where, like ours, where land values are high, the payoff is also, even larger. And if we take a longer view and especially consider the moment of where we're at, that those investments are critical to make now. And we'll go to the final slide. So I just want to, make a final comment about the CLT movement, which I see is very much alive and coming together. The MIT CoLab put out a report earlier this year that kind of I guess identifies some common values of the movement and looks at some of its prospects. It's a great report. I encourage you all to take a look. But it identifies the common values of this movement as decommodification of land, racial justice, economic democracy, and transformative politics. And so we can kind of see how those all trace back the history I just described. But it's a movement that's gaining momentum both at the national, regional, and local level. Obviously, Ofelia and Francis talked a lot about what's going on here in California. And obviously we have this South Bay CLT here. But it's gaining momentum as well in terms of just real numbers. And these are from last year, so I think we have even more properties now, but essentially the number of kind of CLT managed properties is doubling every 3 years in California, which is pretty remarkable. And obviously is already a sizable amount of property and assets that they control. All right, sorry about that. I think I ran a little bit over, so I will stop there and thank everyone for giving me the time.
All right, a huge round of applause to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for participating today and sharing CLTs with us. If we are at 12:58, so I want to check if everyone on screen has like 5 more minutes to answer questions from the audience. Is that okay with everybody? Okay, we're going to run a little bit over. Apologies for the technical issues. That's totally my bad. You'd think I didn't live like in the middle of Silicon Valley. All right, so I'll turn it over to Janae to moderate the questions.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Michael and panelists. So we have a question here. What kinds of local or regional policies would help strengthen the CLT model? Is there anyone that would like to answer that?
I could take a stab at it and then turn it over to others. One of the things that we want to see is an expansion of preservation subsidies. So in San Francisco, they have the small sites program. Oakland, through Measure K, funded the acquisition. It's called the ACAH program, but it's geared towards anti-displacement preservation funding. Another policy we were trying to see is dedicating public lands to permanent affordability. And that could be in the form of a CLT model or not. Another thing that a lot of us are pushing for is a tenant or a community opportunity to purchase act, similarly modeled to the Washington DC's ordinance which allows tenants to, they gives them the right to to make an offer to purchase their home if it goes up on the market. And that's just some of the policies. I don't know if other panels have some things to add.
Just to quickly chime in, those were the two you mentioned two of the ones that I was going to bring up, Francis, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, or Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, and then somehow creating a permanent source of revenue to contribute and funding toward housing preservation that can be leveraged with other funding sources. So for us in East Palo Alto, we currently, this November, we have on the ballot Measure V that is going to, excuse me, increase our transit occupancy tax to outside visitors coming by to visit hotels and to short-term rentals, and channel that funding through a specific tax that will go toward preservation. So our local CLT would be able to apply to that sort of funding and do this kind of work. But yeah, I think you covered them, and if others want to chime in.
You know, there was one other thing I did want to mention is that expanding inclusionary zoning would really be helpful, and allowing that to, or tying that to permanent affordability or some model. An example of that that's really successful is the Housing Land Trust of Sonoma County. They have had a really successful long run of working with the cities of Sonoma, Healdsburg, Cloverdale, where in their housing elements, they have said that when we do inclusionary zoning, it has to be permanently affordable. It's got to be in a 99-year affordability restriction and so on and so forth. And that has led to basically the CLT model being the way that homeownership is done affordably in Sonoma.
Anybody have anything to add to that?
I'll quickly add to just Ofelia mentioned like local policy coming up in our cities, and I know San Jose has been in a year-long process as well to create an anti-displacement plan, if you will, and trying to pilot what might potentially be the first housing project. So I think in this group, as Silicon Valley Leadership Group, we encourage folks to like be part of that. To engage, to learn more, but also be critical, because there's a lot in the policy where CLTs are excluded and intentionally excluded. So again, this is definitely something that we have to advocate for fearlessly.
Great. Thank you. And again, I just want to reintroduce Jocelyn. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask her as well. I know she didn't present, but she's a great resource for questions as well. So we have another question. What is the current per unit subsidy needed, especially for CLTs on the peninsula and Silicon Valley?
Any takers?
No.
You know, I'll just say, I don't, you know, I can't speak to numbers, but I will tell you how we approach this when we look at projects, when we're doing a feasibility analysis of projects. We kind of work backwards from what are the unit sizes, what are the target household size and the target income levels to serve. So if we're looking at 80% AMI households, we work backwards from that, and we'll see what can they afford right now. And what's the gap? And you know, for us, for example, in Oakland, the gap is probably in the $150,000 to $250,000 range for acquisition rehab projects. In Berkeley, it's even higher. It's 300,000 or more. And it's looking like in Richmond and Vallejo, you know, it's lower than that. Silicon Valley, I mean, I've heard things, just horror stories that it's out. I see listings in East Palo Alto where, you know, a little crummy 2 or 3 bedroom bungalow that needs a lot of major work done is $1.5 million. So, and that I can't imagine that the AMI is that much different in East Palo Alto than it is in, say, Oakland.
Right. It's not a really satisfactory answer, but it really does depend. I think some of the numbers that have been offered so far in terms of gaps are absolutely right. And you're absolutely right, Francis. Really shacks, they're shacks. Going for like $1 million, and our average median income in East Palo Alto is $53,000. Not even, it's different than the rest of our affluent San Mateo County neighbors. So we're even lower. Our AMI is even lower than that of our county. So it depends, but you're right. Let's say a family can afford maybe to pay, I don't know, they could afford like a $500,000 home. In that case, if a average home is going for $1 million, that's the gap, like half of it. So it varies, and unfortunately, it's pretty big around our neck of the woods for single family homes, at least. That's kind of where we've been focusing for the most part. There's a bit more to say about like mobile home parks. That's a little lower, but yeah, it kind of depends.
Great, thank you. Before we close out, I just want to get one last question in. We have a few, but I just want to touch on this one. So someone asked, can CLTs be set up by private nonprofits, or do they need to be governmental organizations?
I can answer that. So for the most part, they're private nonprofits. I mean, private in the sense that they are not government sponsored. So they are public benefit charities, like under California nonprofit law. But there are several CLTs which are set up by cities. So the Irvine Community Land Trust was set up by the city of Irvine, and has a very close relationship with the city. I think that's a really successful model where the city, it's leveraging the power of the city and city-controlled land to create permanent affordability. There are kind of flavors of it in, I think in Denver, one that kind of operates as a land bank as well. And then there are other examples where you'll have not larger entities or organizations which spin off and create a community land trust. Oakland Community Land Trust is one example of that. That was actually initially created by the Urban Strategies Council. So there's many different ways that it's approached, but typically they are 501c3s that are not government sponsored.
Great, thank you. Kat, you want to close us out?
Absolutely. So apologies for going over time today and for the technical difficulties, but what a fantastic panel. I want to give a big thank you to all of our panelists as well as our attendees for showing up today to talk about a really important topic, and one that I know has gained a lot of traction in the few years that I've been in housing, and that I'm really excited to see blossom in the next few years. So again, thank you very much. I do want to do a quick plug for a couple of CoHo events we have coming up. Next Thursday at 12 p.m. on this Zoom, we will have an event called Water, Redlining, and Displacement that'll look into the San Jose Anti-Displacement Plan as well as redlining. And then we also will have a Happy Housers Happy Hour Thursday, October 29th at 5 p.m. It is spooktacular, Halloween themed. There's a costume contest. I have a Hauser costume that I know I'm looking forward to wearing, so I hope others will attend and dress up as well. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Janae. We'd be happy to answer them. And again, a big thank you to our panelists for attending and speaking today. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thanks for joining. Links are.
Thank you.
Thanks all.